Good morning. Good morning. If you could take your seats, welcome to the Presidential Plenary. My name is Gary Langham. I'm the AAG Executive Director. Welcome to this plenary entitled Catalyzing Positive Food System Change, Geography and the Future of Food and Agriculture. Your moderator today is Bill Moseley. He's the 2025-2026 President of the AAG and a human, environment, and development geographer with research interests in political ecology, tropical agriculture, environment and development policy, and livelihood security. Bill is the DeWitt Wallace Professor of Geography at Macalester College. His fieldwork, mostly in West and Southern Africa, supports his research interests and connects with his 10 years of practical experience in the field of international development as a project manager and policy analyst for organizations such as Save the Children in the UK, the World Bank Environment Department, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the U.S. Peace Corps. He is also a prolific public scholar specializing in writing op-eds and articles for the popular press. So please join me in welcoming Bill and his panelists.
Thanks, Gary, for the very kind introduction, and thanks to you all for being here. I'm just really excited that you're here, that you're taking away time from lunch to talk about food and agriculture, which is near and dear to my heart. I really have two jobs. First, I'm going to talk about the food system globally, and kind of set the stage for 4 regional talks. And then I'm going to introduce each of our 4 speakers who in turn are going to focus on North America, Africa, Latin America, and then Asia. They have sworn an oath to me that they're going to stay within 12 minutes each, which should leave us sort of 1 minute at the end for some thank yous. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time for questions, so I would encourage you to just come up and talk to the speakers afterwards if you have questions. You may or may not know that in 2015, we launched the Sustainable Development Goals. The second goal was zero hunger by 2030. And since that time, we have been moving in the wrong direction. Between 2017 and 2022, the prevalency and total number of undernourished people in the world grew, as shown in the graph on the left up here. It peaked out at about 1 in 10 people globally were facing food insecurity. The situation has improved slightly since that time, but we have not returned to pre-COVID levels. In terms of the highest number of malnourished people in the world, it's in South Asia. But if we're talking about the region with the highest proportion of people who suffer from hunger, it's the African continent. And that has grown from about 45% in 2015 to 60% today that face moderate to severe food insecurity, which shows up in these bar graphs on the right. Historically, each time the globe has faced a food crisis, we have tended to respond by trying to get out of this problem by producing more food. So in 1972-74, we faced a period of high food prices that you can see in this graph of the FAO Food Price Index. We responded in the Global South with the first wave of the Green Revolution, this emphasis on pushing out industrial food production techniques to the Global South. And in North America, we responded with a Secretary of Ag, Earl Butz, who basically said, get big or get out. And it led to the demise of medium and small-sized farmers in the U.S. Then in the late 1970s, early 80s, we had the third world debt crisis. We responded with structural adjustment and this hyper-focus on the export of agricultural commodities, this drift away from food self-sufficiency. We have another period of high food prices in 2007, 2008, known as the global food crisis. It led to a lot of social unrest in cities, including on the African continent. It made leaders very nervous, and we get the new Green Revolution for Africa, which is a reboot of that first Green Revolution focused on African crops. And then more recently, we have the COVID pandemic, we have the war in Ukraine, we have our dear leader's tariff policy, which has led to another period of high prices. But I would argue this time the response has been less clear. There's been some disorder, some questioning of the protectionist consensus, and the increasing collapse of multilateralism. Which leads us to the present moment, where we have a food system that progressively over time is dependent on a few major breadbaskets, using energy-intensive food production methods, highly dependent on trade, and it's vulnerable to all different types of shocks: energy price hikes, supply chain disruptions, pandemics, climate change, and war, including our most recent war in the Middle East, in Iran, where we have seen the destruction of fertilizer production facilities, which is going to impact food production in other parts of the world, the closing down of the Straits of Hormuz, the export of fossil fuels, which also fuel our global food system. Those of you who know me know that I am an optimist by nature, and so I'm always looking for signs of hope. And one of the signs of hope for me is the way we think about food security. And even though we have a history of narrowly focusing on food production, food availability, increasingly in the scholarly community, we have a more complex and nuanced understanding of food security. We acknowledge that access to food is important. Amartya Sen, with his entitlement theory, really helped us focus on this, including the work of William Dondo, which actually preceded the work of Amartya Sen. Utilization, which is about how you prepare food, your cooking knowledge, access to cooking facilities, clean water, sanitation is also important. Stability, the stability of food prices over time and supplies. And most recently, a fifth and sixth dimension, which the corporate community has begrudgingly begun to accept as well: sustainability, not undermining the environment to produce food for today, and agency, the involvement of people and farmers in their food production system. I am also encouraged by the emergence of agroecology. This is a paradigm that has been around for decades. I first studied it in the early 1990s, but increasingly it's being accepted by the international community. Agroecologists think about farm fields like a modified ecosystem, and if we study the interactions between different crops, crops in the soil, crops in the insects, we can leverage those insects to produce more healthy food sustainably. Agroecology is also a social movement, and different civil society organizations like Via Campesina have played really, really important roles in bringing this paradigm to the attention of the global community. And now within UN institutions, we talk about it as a viable alternative. And lastly, I would argue that agroecology is important because it is a more decolonial paradigm. This is not just controlled by formal scientists working in labs, but it is also working with farmers, who I think of as scientists, who have really important experiential knowledge. They've historically done things like intercropping and agroforestry, as shown in these photographs. And so the idea is about bridging those two worlds of informal and formal knowledge. So on to our panelists. I'm going to introduce all four here, and then I'll have our first one come up. First of all, we have Julie Guthman, a geographer by training and a distinguished professor of sociology emerita at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Over her career, she has conducted multiple research projects examining how racial capitalism and its cultural manifestations have shaped the conditions of possibility for transforming food production and consumption. She was the principal investigator of the UC After Project, a multi-campus collaboration that investigated Silicon Valley's forays into food and agriculture. Her most recent book, The Problem with Solutions: Why Silicon Valley Can't Hack the Future of Food, draws on that research and 2 decades of teaching in the Community Studies program at UC Santa Cruz. Her post-retirement commitments include serving on the board of Mesa Refuge, a writer's retreat focused on social justice, environmental justice, and economic equity, and continuing to co-edit the UC Press Critical Environments series. After Julie, we have Dr. Hanson Nyantakyi-Frimpong, an associate professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at University of Denver. He is a political ecologist with research focused on questions at the intersection of the human dimensions of global environmental change and sustainable agriculture and food systems. He is the author of over 60 scientific publications. He has received numerous awards for his innovative and participatory approaches to human environment research, including the 2021 Distinguished Scholar Award from the Africa Specialty Group of the AAG. He is a contributing author of the 6th Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and currently serves as editor of the journal Gender, Place, and Culture. Third, we have Daniela Ayelen Marini, who's an assistant professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies at Grand Valley State University in Allendale, Michigan. She earned her PhD in geography from the University of Colorado Boulder, followed by degrees in biological sciences from the National University of Rio Cuarto, Argentina, and a Master of Science in Forestry from the Yale School of Environment. Her research uses political ecology to examine how race, class, and gender shape alternative agri-food movements and environmental activism in Argentina and the United States, and she is a member of the Collective of Agrarian Scholar Activists from the South, and her forthcoming book will be Unsettling Agro-Extractivism, Whiteness, Agroecology, and the Grassroots Alternatives in Argentina. Last up, we have Dr. Li Zhang, an assistant professor of sociology and environmental studies at Amherst College. She is the author of Origins of COVID-19, China and Global Capitalism. Dr. Zhang is working on her second monograph, Defying Slow Death, Unsafe Food Governance, and Quiet Social Movements in China, a long-term ethnography of quiet social movements for agroecology, food safety governance, and agrarian change in China that poses empirical questions about food system sustainability in China and theoretical questions about the nature of sustainable development itself. She is also co-editor of a collection of new agrarian questions in the 21st century, forthcoming by Routledge in spring of 2026. So that's our panel. I'm really excited about hearing these 4 talks today, and you should also notice that there's a nice spread of senior to more junior scholars, and I think that's what makes our discipline great. Thank you. Julie.
Is this the way we advance it? How do I advance this?
He'll pull up your talk.
What's that? Okay. Okay. Hi, is my talk going to, oh, there we go. Thank you. And then this will advance it. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, Bill, for including me. Bill actually gave us a really tall order for this talk under the theme of the future of food. He asked us to speak about our own research and its geographic context, which for me is more California than North America per se, although I can say stuff about North America, but not in the context of the 12 minutes. Contributions of and directions for geographers in this area, and somehow convey positivity about how to transform food, all in 12 minutes. And now, of course, I'm really tempted to respond to your presentation, but I can't do that. So the way I'm going to approach this is to touch on my 3 most significant research projects, all of which are very much California stories, and say what they tell us about the future of food. It's a very kind of narrow slice on this, but I think it's a meaningful slice. I will give my most attention to the most recent project on Silicon Valley, since that was explicitly about the future of food as defined by the Silicon Valley tech world. So as Bill mentioned, virtually all of my research has been about the conditions of possibility for transforming food production, distribution, and consumption. Along with other geographers, I have done this through a critical political ecology lens, investigating how political economic dynamics, or the logic of capital, cultural politics, and scientific knowledge production and technological change shape possible futures. All these are mainstays of agrarian studies more generally. What I think has made this work quintessentially geographic is its engagements with the historical geographies of place in shaping possible futures, which very much shows up in my work in California, and the treatment of more than human lives and features as active participants in shaping agri-food trajectories. Indeed, I think these two sensibilities are essential to what geographic scholarship brings to the study of food. But mine are generally not happy stories. I'm less of an optimist than Bill, and more often than not, my analysis has pointed to constraints on imagined better futures. But I have something to say about that, though, at the end, so stay with me. So let's get to it. The first project I want to touch on was my earliest dissertation-based work on organics in California. Through an extensive study of growers, certifiers, regulators, and advocates, I explored the practices of organic farming by both old-timers and newbies, and how the regulatory politics around the organic label shaped what was possible for farming otherwise. One of my core findings that still sticks with me revolved on the value of land. That's why you see that photo on the right. Namely, I noted how expectations of crop value from high-value crops that are very typical for California, intensification of production practices, also very typical in California, and the construction of cheap labor exploitation, what Carrie McWilliams once called the great exception of California, was embedded into the cost of land, and that makes it very challenging to grow in less intensive and ecological ways. Ironically, growers who were entering into organics at the time I was doing my research in the mid-90s were looking for a way to get more value per acre, but they were playing into that particular treadmill that is so endemic to California of getting more crop value and land values rise accordingly. And so without some major subsidy to land, whether that's an inheritance or a completely different business model, such as a diversified farming and direct marketing, few farmers were farming that much differently than their conventional counterparts. And this idea that I developed in the course of my work on organics was denoted by others as the conventionalization thesis. Many years later, here you see land showing up again. There, that way, I keep pointing to that. Okay. Many years later, I conducted a major project on strawberry production inspired by a series of regulatory setbacks for the industry. This included the ban of the ozone-depleting methyl bromide and the activist-led end to a replacement for methyl bromide called methyl iodide. Strawberry production had long depended on the use of highly toxic soil fumigants to control soil-borne pests. Among other things, fumigants allowed growers to plant on the same block of land year after year, creating huge increases in productivity. Normally, the soils would be too infested unless you fumigated. But what I found was that an entire assemblage of human and non-human actors had come together to make strawberry production profitable in California. And that included not only up until the moment I started doing the research, lax regulation on fumigants, but a labor system built on piece rate, a breeding apparatus that was geared toward productive plants rather than pest resistance, and the remarkable so-called natural advantages of sandy soils and ocean air-conditioned coastal land that made strawberries viable over many months of a year. We call it the eternal spring. You wouldn't believe it this week in California, but normally we have cool, foggy weather on the coast for most months of the summer, and that allows a long, long season for strawberries. By the time I conducted my research on this in the 2010s, all of these advantages were being threatened, not least of which was competing urban uses for that land. And you can see that on that bottom part of the right slide, where you have houses abutting strawberry fields. Why? Because suburbanites also like those cool ocean breezes, the natural air conditioning of the Pacific Ocean. And so the entire strawberry production system had become very fragile. But while some growers were successful at growing strawberries without fumigants and highly diversified systems, most couldn't easily access increasingly costly, even if infested land. So land figured really importantly in that project as well. Inspired by some of the techno solutions I was seeing to the fragility of strawberry growing, including the development of robots to replace labor and the creation of soilless systems to address the soil-borne pathogens, I embarked on another major project immediately following the strawberry project. This one, a collaborative project with several other critical agri-food study scholars, a couple of whom at least I've seen are in this room, so thank you for attending and hearing this yet again. Together, we investigated how the ever more hubristic Silicon Valley-based tech sector imagined it could fix the issues with food and farming. One of our core findings was actually that the techies were fairly clueless about the dynamics of food and farming, and especially they were clueless about how past technological introductions had created more problems than they had solved. Indeed, as agrarian studies scholars have repeatedly shown, most technological introductions have been profitable for the input suppliers or the processors and manufacturers that surround the farm, but rarely the farmers or consumers who they claim they want to help with the technology. As for the techies, we found that their solutions they proffered were, of course, narrow and technical, designed to fix a problem that the technology they had on offer could solve. So they could come up with more ways for productivity, and Bill already mentioned that productivity has been a problem, not a solution to our food system problems. Or more data. Data for what? Farmers have a lot of data. They see with their own eyes what's going on in their fields. In the book, I call this solutionism, such that the solution precedes the problem analysis. And of course, none of the solutions they promoted were suited to address historical social relations of land, labor, credit, and more that have brought cheap food, but at tremendous ecological and social costs. And this is because what they were offering was, by definition, techno fixes, designed to skirt the sticky world of politics and social change. Still, what lingers most from that project is not so much the silliness of many of the fixes they had on offer, and some of them were quite silly, but it is the tech sector's claims on the future of food. As self-described techno-optimists, I think their discourses can tell us a lot about positive or not so positive food futures. Indeed, these so-called techno-optimists tend to project futures in which their solutions will be the only ones that are reasonable and doable. And so they are actively dismissive about, say, diversified farming, agroecology, or other practices actively practiced today. And that is because they operate completely on the presumption of scarcity. Feeding the coming 10 billion is a constant refrain in the tech sector with every pitch they make for every product, as they ask us to get on board with their various alternative proteins, such as cellular or fermented meat, or even the digital tools designed to better visualize how to use precious resources like water or minimize pesticide use. Speculative projections of a future of scarcity that can only be fixed with their technologies has become a near necessity to obtain the speculative finance of venture capital on which their business plans depend. Now, we have a whole new terrain right now, given how Trump and Netanyahu have chosen this war in Iran that has led to an oil crisis that is already affecting agriculture worldwide. So bracketing that, and we don't know what's going to happen to that. Before that, the scarcity that the techies were projecting just hadn't borne out. And that is because the industrial food system has an uncanny ability to spit out cheap food, for better or for worse. And that is why, some of the companies that have invested in these alternatives dependent on scarcity, such as vertical farming or alternative protein, have failed spectacularly so far. They simply cannot compete with industrial food production as it is currently practiced. And so, we saw a lot of things go out of business toward the end of our project. And so, as Madeline Fairbairn and I argue in one of our articles, the profitability of these futuristic technologies turns on collapse of the existing system, which means that these tech sector people have an interest in bringing the current system down rather than preventing its failure. So they are therefore much less interested in doing much in the present to make existing systems less ecologically destructive or cruel to animals. And so you have to ask, how positive or optimistic is that? Indeed, what gives lie to this kind of optimism is the increasingly apparent comfort of tech and venture capital with Trumpism. I mean, these guys are well aligned with Trump. Some of the biggest venture capitalists are, like Peter Thiel, the other guy whose name is eluding me. So they're aligned with Trumpism. They align with some of them align with accelerationism, what Naomi Klein and Astor Taylor call end times fascism, a situation where the wealthy elite actually want to accelerate collapse with expectations that they can survive through AI or space colonization or secure high-tech enclaves, maybe as imagined on that cornucopia up there. This kind of impulse to shut themselves out was nicely satired in the movie Don't Look Up. I won't spoil the ending if you haven't seen it, but it doesn't turn out so well for the ultra-billionaire techies. Given all this, I believe we need to recast what optimism is. At its best, or at least cynical, techno-optimism in the future of food is bringing a set of technologies divorced from a very good analysis of what's wrong, under the presumption that we can't easily change people, or we can't easily change institutions. We can just fix it with the technology. But again, that all assumes that our problems with the food system are technological rather than political. Put simply, I don't think, and I'm sure many of you agree, that what's getting in the way of a just and ecological food future is a lack of technology. To the contrary, so many technological introductions have only reinforced the deeply embedded and highly unequal land, labor, and capital relations that have been with us for a long time. And so by way of closing, and I hope I haven't gone too long, I'm going to be super cheeky and suggest we shouldn't be conceding the discursive ground of techno-optimism and its concerns with the future of food. I'll go out on a limb and say we have the knowledge and technology to produce the food we need right now, including following those principles of agroecology that Bill was suggesting have really become more mainstream, kind of. What we need is to undermine the political crap that's holding us back from proliferating more just and sustainable food systems. So at this moment, at this time in history, I think that what's getting in the way is fascism. And I can't even imagine right now making progress in the food system without changing the direction of the US and unfortunately many other countries in the world. So really, to have a better future of food requires first and foremost a vibrant anti-fascist politics in the present, not the future. There is no alternative, and that's where hope lies. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Bill, thank you so much for this invitation. It's a real honor and pleasure for me to be part of this panel and have a conversation on food and agriculture. And good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for showing up, as Bill said, for fitting your lunch to come and listen to questions on questions and conversations around food and agriculture. 12 minutes is really tight, especially if you want to talk about these issues in the African context, so I'm going to try my best to flag what I see as some of the key issues when it comes to feeding a growing population and then looking into the future of food security, especially in the African context. I will spend about 2 minutes framing what I see as, and what I often argue as a broken food system, and then I will spend about 7-8 minutes talking about political ecology research in Africa and what that research has shown us about why we still have a food crisis in a continent like Africa. And if I have time, maybe 2 minutes, I will talk about possibilities for hope in terms of feeding the African continent. Okay. I'll start with 2 broad questions. One is our food system really in crisis? And if it's in crisis, what sort of evidence do we have to show that we have a food system that is in crisis? And to look for answers to these 2 questions, I'll pull up data from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's State of Food Insecurity in the World report that is published every July. This is the most recent report that came up last year. It's a very long report, but normally when the report comes, the first 7 pages has what they call core messages. So I'm going to flag for you some of the key core messages that were evident in the most recent report. You see a bunch of statistics on the slide that I have in here. I won't have time to walk through all of that. But the first point is that today we have almost between 638 million and 720 million people who wake up every morning without knowing where their next meal is coming from. That's a huge number. That's almost 1 out of every 12 people. They don't know where they are going to get breakfast, lunch, or dinner, which is very depressing. Now, if you move down the line, you see that 23% of children who are under age 5 are also stunted, which means they are too short for their age. And if you are stunted, it means you are not eating a healthy meal. And we have almost 1 out of every 4 kids in the world who is facing issues of stunting. Next is about 30% of women are anemic, which means they don't have a lot of blood or they lack blood, and these are all nutritional consequences. If you look at the right side, 2.6 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet just because our food is so expensive and not everybody can afford to buy healthy and nutritious food. And then the last but one indicator on the right side, you see that in the African continent, one of the key things about the report is that always it has a regional component. And as Bill mentioned, Africa is one of the regions where we have a lot of people who are food insecure. If you look at the last report that came up, almost 307 million Africans are facing issues of hunger. And that is 1 out of every 5 Africans. And then the last one is that 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the agriculture or food sector. So the way we produce our food is not sustainable. It actually increases climate change, it degrades our environment, and overall causes more food insecurities. It's a long report, as I said, but these are some of the highlights that I will use to frame my remarks this afternoon. On top of that, so despite, if you look at the graph I have in here, I have figures for global cereal production. And this is just a snapshot. If you look at maize or corn, depending on which part of the Atlantic that you are coming from, rice, wheat, barley, these are all cereals where we are producing more than ever before. If you look at figures from the early 1960s up to the contemporary period, we are producing more food than ever before. And if you look at the regional level, even here in North America, we produce more cereals than ever before. If you go to South America, Europe, Asia, and Africa, where I come from, we produce more food now than ever before. So what you see is a contradiction. Even though we are producing more food, a lot of people are also still food insecure. And that is what I argue as the broken food system. Because what you see is a catastrophic failure of our food system now being able to feed a growing and hungry population. Geographers, especially human geographers, have spent a lot of time in the African continent trying to understand why we have such a crisis. And we have over 40 years of human environment research in the African context, examining some of the contradictions that I've just pointed out. I don't have time, again, because of the 12 minutes, but what I have here is a snapshot of some of the critical research in the African context that have shaped the way and manner in which we think about food and some of the reasons why we continue to have a food crisis. I will start with Michael Watt's excellent book that was published in 1983. The fieldwork itself was done somewhere around 1978 and 1979, but the book came out in 1983. And he spent a lot of time in northern Nigeria trying to understand why is it that if you go to Nigeria, a lot of people are food insecure. His main questions were that, is it because of drought? Because northern Nigeria is closer to the Sahara Desert. And there's a lot of argument that most people in there are food insecure because of issues of drought. And Watt's research pointed to the contrary, that it's not an issue of drought, but it has got to do with a lot of politics, which I'll flag later on in my subsequent slides. Another work that I'll point out is Rick Schroeder's work in the Gambia. It's not necessarily about food and agriculture, but it talks about intra-household social relations and how that shape food and hunger at a household level, especially gender division of labor, income sharing, and how all those shape who has access to food within households. Tom Bassett also has done a lot of work in Cote d'Ivoire. In 2001, he published a book on peasant cotton revolution in Ivory Coast, also talking about some of the political economic dynamics that shape food systems in West Africa. And more recently, Matthew Schooner, who is a Canadian geographer, has published the African Gene Revolution, which talks about the way and manner in which the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other organizations are shaping the food security context in sub-Saharan Africa. And the most recent one was published by Bill Moseley, which is titled Decolonizing African Agriculture. And there is a chapter on agroecology, there is a chapter on the history of agriculture in Africa going back to the last 60 years. As I said, this is just a snapshot because I don't have time. But if you look at all this body of political ecology research, they convey 5 key messages which I'm going to summarize for you. The first one is that for most organizations and countries that are trying to deal with the food crisis, they often conceptualize it as an issue of production. So there's so much emphasis on the quantity of food produced versus the quality of food, the food that we are producing. So there's an issue of we need to produce more food to feed a hungry population. And there is no serious thinking about the quality of the food that we produce. And for those who conceptualize the food crisis as an issue of productivity, their main idea is that you need to use more mechanization, you need more fertilizers, you need more pesticides to increase production and feed a growing population. But what that does is that it actually intensifies hunger. It causes micronutrient deficiency, it degrades the environment, and leads to a cycle of food insecurity over time. And most political ecology research has shown that the idea of conceptualizing hunger as an issue of productivity or just producing more food is very simplistic and is not going to help us address the food crisis, especially in the African context. This is a quote from Cornell development sociologist Phil McMichael, and I like this because this is a paper he published many years ago. And this is how he summarizes the way and manner in which a lot of countries are conceptualizing the food crisis. He says that the understanding of the crisis and the method proposed to solve it simply recycles the problem as a solution. And that is the reason why a lot of people are still food insecure in the African context. The second point is neo-Malthusian narratives, especially in the African context. A lot of people think that we are having an increasing global population that will reach 9 billion people by the year 2050, so we need to produce more food to feed that that increasing population. That's a neo-Malthusian way of explaining the food crisis. And for those people who think in this context, again, their main idea is that you need to increase production with mechanization, using more synthetic fertilizers, synthetic chemicals, and in doing so, as I said earlier on, it actually intensifies the food crisis. And there has been a lot of political ecology research showing that neo-Malthusian narratives or neo-Malthusian framing of the food crisis actually intensifies it. The third point is lack of historical sensitivity. A lot of countries and organizations that are promoting food security solutions often do so without looking backward, without looking at the history of the region, without looking at the history of, for example, land enclosures, the history of neoliberalization, the post-colonial history of structural adjustment programs, and what all of these have done to access to land, access to capital, and access to labor. And because of the lack of historical awareness, some of the solutions that they put in place actually intensifies the crisis in the African context. This is a quote from Michael Watt's book. He says that history does matter, and there is no better way of preparing for the future, in part, without looking backward. So if you are proposing a food security situation without looking at what has been occurring in the past, then definitely your solutions are likely to fail. The fourth one is intra-household gender politics, and this is coming from a lot of feminist political ecology research that has been done in the region. There's a lot of evidence showing that the household level has a lot of politics. There are politics around gender division of labor, access to land, income sharing, especially in pooling and non-pooling households. And so if you have a food security solution that ignores all of these, it is bound to fail. And a lot of feminist political ecology research going back to Rick Schroeder's work in the Gambia has shown that we need to pay attention to politics at the household level. Among co-wives, between men and men, children and the elders, if you ignore all of that, it's really going to affect the way and manner in which your food security solutions will shape up. And not just gender, but also intersectional inequalities. We have a lot of evidence showing that in most cases, it's not just gender, but gender mapped up onto class, onto race, onto disability, nationality. All of these come up in very complex ways to shape the way and manner in which the food crisis is shaping up in the African context. And the last point from political ecology research is lack of respect for indigenous epistemologies or ways of knowing. There's a lot of assumptions that indigenous African farming methods are backward, they are unproductive, and they need change. They need to be changed with scientific methods. And there has been a lot of evidence showing that this is a very wrong way of conceptualizing the food crisis in the African context. So again, there's a lot to be said about the political ecology work in the African context, but these are 5 key points that I want to summarize from the existing work that has been done. In terms of looking into the future, I have 1 minute, all right. I will echo Bill's point that the most sustainable solution is looking into agroecology, which is a science, which is a movement, and which is a practice. And what I have here is a slide showing the 13 principles of agroecology. The beauty of agroecology is that all the green principles you see here are rooted in ecology. And those in orange or red, depending on the resolution of the projector, are those focusing on politics and social relations. And it's one of the main solutions that attends to both the ecological dynamics of the food system and also the political aspects of the way and manner in which we produce food. So if we want to cut down the number of hungry people from 811 million people to 0 as envisioned in the SDG 2, then in my view, the best way to approach that is to use agroecology. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Bill, for the invitation. In the last 30 years, the cultivation of herbicide-resistant soy in South America has reshaped landscapes, economies, and forms of governance, intensifying processes of land concentration and the destruction of social natures. Focusing on Argentina, I engage with the impacts of soy agribusiness to ask a broader question. Where do the seeds for just agri-food system transformation actually come from? So to answer this question, I start my presentation with looking briefly at the extent of the soy complex in South America to make sense of the dimensions of the challenges we face, and also to bring attention to the frictions of what often appears to be a smooth global system of agricultural commodity supply chains. This map illustrates the river system that supports South America's vast soy economy. Spanning from Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, it links some of the continent's most vital ecological regions, from the dry forests in the Gran Chaco to the wetlands of El Pantanal region to the lush Atlantic forest in Brazil to global commodity markets in Asia and Europe. At the heart of this network are the Paraná River and the Paraguay River, which together form the Paraná-Paraguay Hydroway, a continental transport corridor moving immense volumes of soy from inland production zones to export ports on the Atlantic coast. In Argentina, this system converges on the agro-industrial hub of Rosario, where multinational companies operate large terminals to store, crush, and ship soy products to global markets. On the surface, this appears to be a highly efficient system, a vast logistical network seamlessly channeling agricultural production from the continent's interior to global consumers. But this apparent smoothness hinges on a fragile reality, which is the river itself. In recent years, critically low water levels have disrupted barge traffic and driven up the costs of moving grain. So what seems like a seamless export machine is in fact deeply vulnerable to ecological changes that threaten the stability of the entire supply chain. As we've seen with the rivers and ports in Argentina, rather than a smooth, frictionless soy pipeline feeding the global livestock industry, soy supply chains are fundamentally dependent on situated ecologies, bodies, and institutions that not only provide the materials, but also the social relations for trust, for labor management, and for trade, and also the social acceptance of this dominant agricultural system, all of which remain crucially important for its successful operation. So rather than treating the soy complex as an abstract global force increasingly disarticulated from specific ecologies and social relations, geographic scholarship crucially investigates how agribusiness actors actively reconfigure their relationship to the concrete landscapes where they operate, and also geographic scholarship is looking at how communities in soy-producing regions are denouncing, resisting, and challenging the destruction of their livelihoods and environments. So the vulnerabilities and externalities of the soy system reveal openings for change, showing that the system is not as rigid or as unchallengeable as it may seem. So this brings us to the strategies that are already emerging to transform the dominant agri-food system from within and from outside. So the first strategy I investigate is the creation of environmental protection zones in towns and cities in agribusiness regions. Since the early 2000s, with the health impacts of herbicides used in expanding soy fields became perceptible on people's bodies, urban communities organized to document, to collect data on health impacts of pesticide drift, and they also sought collaborations with medical doctors and researchers to legitimize their claims to municipal and provincial governments. By 2017, 260 towns and municipalities in soy-producing regions, like the ones shown on this map focusing on Córdoba province, had passed municipal ordinances that ban or limit fumigation in proximity to towns and water sources. The specific restrictions differ from locality, ranging from 100 meters to 2,000 meters from city limits, depending on the level of toxicity and the mode of application of approved herbicides. Some towns have promoted the development of agroecology on these chemical-free buffer zones to provide local residents with uncontaminated foods. Despite the lack of enforcement of these ordinances in many cases, the endorsement of these environmental protection zones represent an important affirmation of residents' constitutional right to a clean and healthy environment. These initiatives have helped pave the way for Argentina's first criminal trial on illegal fumigations, and also several provincial court decisions that restrict pesticide use near urban areas. These efforts have also led to the construction of a network of medical doctors from fumigated towns, and also the creation of an international network of researchers committed to worthy science. While these efforts are crucial for protecting affecting communities from ongoing pesticide drift, they also work to accommodate soy expansion by displacing the problem into rural areas outside of municipal jurisdiction, which speaks to some of the limitations of this strategy. The second strategy I engage with comes from the demands for access to land by Bolivian migrant farmers in Argentina, controlling the production of fresh vegetable in most major cities in the country. By the 1980s, when horticulture, fresh vegetable cultivation in Argentina, became less economically attractive for farmers of European descent, Criollo farmers, Bolivian farmers who were temporarily employed in sugarcane and tobacco plantation in the Argentine north started to develop this activity that Criollo farmers were abandoning. Their migratory trajectory involved trying luck in different regions in the country before settling in their new permanent places of residence. In a few years, extended families of Bolivian migrants developed thriving horticultural regions in Argentina, known as green belts, surrounding most major cities in the country. Bolivian horticulturalists typically rent the land they work and employ family labor and also hire labor from network of extended migrants from the same place of origin. They commercialize their products in centralizing markets where there is no price control and long chains of intermediaries who profit from their labor. In my work, I analyze how ethnic racial segmentations of the labor force in Argentina position Bolivian workers at the bottom of labor hierarchies, but in the remaining of my presentation, I will be focusing on their proposals and their capacity for change and action. Back. So excluded from the subsidies, institutions, and infrastructure that benefit agribusiness actors, organizations of small farmers of Bolivian origin have coalesced under the banner The Other Countryside to signal that while soybean is being shipped overseas, there is a different agricultural sector feeding Argentines. One of the most vocal organizations is the Land Workers Union, that together with other organizations of small farmers have institutionalized a new form of organized protest, which is verdurazos, from produce or verdura in Spanish. So vegetable farmers bring hundreds of crates full of produce, pulling them with tractors to central iconic locations such as the National Congress in Buenos Aires to denounce the lack of support for small farmers, the rising cost of production, and the need to access land ownership to secure permanent housing and dignified lives for small farmers. These verdurazos, since 2015, have become a platform to launch the land access law that was submitted already 4 times to the federal government. The proposed legislation aims at creating a public trust fund to offer small farmers low-interest loan to eventually access land ownership. This is the closest Argentines have ever been to talk about and to envision pathways for agrarian reform in the country. Besides this legal mechanism proposed to access land, the Land Workers Union has created 10 agroecological colonies on fiscal lands by occupying land and engaging on lengthy negotiations with different layers of government to obtain use permits. In these colonies that have become important spaces for social and political experimentation in the country, families share machinery, produce their own bio-inputs, and distribute agroecological products through alternative marketing networks. They have also established community schools and community health centers. So within the Land Workers Union, organized women farmers have established a gender department that works towards eliminating gender-based violence on their bodies, farms, and houses. They link the violence inflicted on the land by the extractive agribusiness model to the violence women experience on their own bodies, advancing an understanding of territory as an extension of the body. Everybody has a body and a territory, not because we own them, but because we're part of them, they contend. From this perspective, land is inseparable from embodied life, not a commodity, but a living relationship, signaling a profound epistemic shift that challenges the dominant agricultural system at its core. The image body territory, the image concept body territory emerges from Latin American community feminism, which understands the body as the first site targeted by power and also as the first space from which resistance is articulated. Echoing indigenous and campesino struggles across the continent, organized women farmers in Argentina claim their right to decide over both production and social reproduction within the household and in the fields, linking bodily autonomy to collective control over the land they cultivate. This feminist grassroots approach positions agroecology not merely as a farming method, but as an ethics of care to tend body territories, and also as a strategy to defend the commons against the intertwined violences of patriarchy, capitalism, and colonization. So Argentina is a country long constructed as white and dominated by agribusiness actors. And in this context, I see the seeds of dissent emerging from the cultural creativity and collective consciousness that extends over more than humans by Bolivian migrant farmers producing the produce we eat in the country. So elevating the voices of those advancing feminist grassroots agroecology helps expand what counts as agricultural politics, generating new possibilities for food system transformation. My book, Seeds of Dissent, I changed the title, Bill, advances this perspective and is currently under review for the forthcoming Critical Geographies of Latin America and the Caribbean series, published by the University of Florida Press, which highlights new areas of geographical inquiry and also special imaginaries emerging from the region. So stay tuned, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to begin with sharing something you won't learn from my professional bio. I come from Henan province in central China, which is the largest agricultural and the most populous provinces in China. There, I grew up in a poor peasant family. So when I speak of hollow villagers, left behind population and slow death in China, I'm not drawing on ethnographical and feminist political ecology research, but I'm also drawing on my personal experiences. The passing of my mother at the age of 65 from lung cancer last November. My disabled father who no longer can farm. My unemployed and unmarried brother, my widowed sister, and my college-aged nephew and niece, who lack social safety net but refuse to farm the land to which our family still has use rights. So this is personal, but it's also the research subject. These lived experiences as a microcosm of the phenomenon I'm talking about today. The crises facing food and agriculture in China are severe, and many of their broad strokes will be recognizable to you from your own research across the world. Since 2009, I have been examining how Chinese state and society have been handling this kind of crisis, how a genuine and a bit quiet social movement from agroecology, food sovereignty, environmental sustainability, and public health emerged, developed, and it's becoming constricted by its internal tensions, climate change, and the growing securitization of food under authoritarianism. The current moment feels hopeless. So how can we keep up hope in this situation? Overcoming hunger has been the core of agrarian questions in China since imperial times. My mother was born in 1960 during the Great Leap Forward and carried the scars of malnourishment until the end of her life. The response to this fear of famine has been a productive strive that cuts across late-chain modernizers, nationalists, Maoists, and the present leadership. The focus was always quantity, not quality. The market reforms that began with Deng Xiaoping brought questions of quality into foreground. After fulfilling grain quotas, peasants in China could diversify to high-value specialty crops and keep profits. But the perceived quality of peasants shift in the opposite directions. Any respect of the peasantry from revolutionary Maoism fell back to deeply established prejudice against peasants as low-quality people. And when some people got rich first, as Deng said, a growing urban consumer class began eating specialty produce, meats from factory farms, even beef, exotic food from abroad. These new dietary habits expanded to the entire country. But as Chinese society defeated the threat of hunger, it produced a triple catastrophe in its wake. First, environmental contamination of air, water, and soil, the dark underbelly of agricultural modernization, and the social disintegration, hollow villages, aging population. In 2025, last year, the net population decrease in China within a single year last year was 3.3 million. Together with that is the cheapening of peasant land and their labor in facing our growing urbanization. Lastly, a mounting health emergency that I characterize in my work as slow death, featured with food safety scandals year after year,
chronic disease epidemics, and the aging population, and the emergence of pandemic infectious disease like SARS and COVID-19. The general feeling is that we are no longer worried about hunger. We're so afraid of getting sick. Sounds familiar. These crises are entangled and they're intensifying. Climate change compounds all of them. Last year marked the worst of both drought and flood in 60 years record in my hometown and both my field sites. But within this crisis, something has also been emerging. A counter movement from the top down by the state to better regulate agriculture and food markets, modernizing governance and production to render food safety and public health governable. And alongside it, a bottom-up counter movement by Chinese society, peasants producing safer food for themselves, scientists, NGO organizers, cultivating alternative food networks, and urban consumers who are more health conscious, trying to protect themselves and their family. Let me show you what these counter movements look like in practice and why they're not enough. The 2008 Sanlu baby milk powder scandal, contaminated formula that killed hundreds of people, made food safety a major national issue. China's food safety governance is relatively new, modeled on the US FDA. I conducted ethnography of the implementation of the 2015 food safety law, which was launched at the same time as a broader Healthy China Action Plan. I accompanied government inspections of school canteens, restaurants, markets, and farms. But all these technocrat interventions, traceability, testing, monitoring, certificates, digital platforms, amount to a kind of scientism. A remarkably persistent assumption from Maoism into the present that technological modernization will resolve the crisis, ignoring how narrow technocratic approaches create our predicament in the first place. Since regulators are under intense pressure, they implemented the regulation in ways that protect their careers. The standardized pro forma regulation, they impose mesh the operations of large actors, but are largely non-exist among peasant farmers. Only 3 of 18 county officials I interviewed in Guangxi trust that this could fundamentally solve the food safety crisis. It can't, because it takes for granted the commodification and scaling up that created the problem and undermines the agroecological foundation necessary for genuine food safety. So what about the response from below? The 2008 crisis also triggered bottom-up counter-movement. Most scholarship characterize these kind of alternative food networks as initiatives by health-conscious urban consumers, NGOs, many established by intellectuals who had studied or worked abroad and brought back ideas of CSAs and farmers market. By 2019, there were already 1,500 ecological farms and 300 CSAs. In my research, however, I emphasize how these AFNs are rooted in peasant production for self-protection, which scholars in China call one family, two systems. Peasants use pesticides and fertilizers for cash crop, but grow their own food without or even less agrochemicals on marginal land. At first, this was about reducing costs. With the food safety crisis, they realized it was also about producing safer food for themselves and their families. But with the deepening food safety crisis and the commodification of every corner of life, peasants have started selling their safer food to wealthier consumers and turning to cheaper, unsafer food for themselves. Safer, organic food has never become more than a niche market. Health inequality now compounds income inequality. These counter-movements from above and below are real, but both are fraying. For about 10 years, from 2008 to 2018, there was space for growth. The feminization of farming, oftentimes framed negatively as left behind women caring for elders and children, also carried emancipatory potential. I was the so-called left behind child. And my mother worked the field until her illness stopped her last year. But I'm also a researcher who documents women's agency in cultivating agroecology and food sovereignty in China, especially in the mountainous ethnic minority areas, both among prominent leaders of AFNs and ordinary women on the ground. Some younger urban educated people are also returning to the countryside, with the state reporting last year about 12 million returnees. But the most prominent of this kind of representation appears dangerously close to rural gentrification, not revitalizing peasant society so much as carving niches in its ruins. Meanwhile, the peasants themselves are aging. Over 18% of the rural population is now over 70. Chronic disease reduces their capacity to farm, and the young do not want to farm. Those who still farm face droughts, floods, and market pressures from every angle. Since 2018, the ground shifts further. Trade wars, COVID-19, wars, and climate change push the state back towards productivism, focus on quantity and food security. And the top-down and bottom-up counter movement are becoming constricted. This is the hopeless situation I described at the beginning. So where is there still room for hope? These counter movements have produced a genuine possibility for positive transformation in China's food and farming system, agroecology against scientism, women remaking rural life, a holistic understanding and approach to food, environment, and health that reverberates at the highest level of the state governance. These top-down and bottom-up counter-movements converge in what I call quiet social movement for agroecology, public health, and food sovereignty. These are intentionally depoliticized efforts that transform agriculture practice through everyday life rather than political confrontation. Drawing on feminist political ecology and Polanyi political economy, my work shows how rooted networks operate under authoritarian conditions by strategically incorporating rather than opposing state discourses of ecological civilization and rural revitalization. But in these recent years, the movement has weakened. It has become less agroecological, less transformational, less ambitious, less supported by state subsidies, even as the state co-opts the language of agroecology and food sovereignty. My case in Henan gave up its organic certificate. My case in Guangxi, the government loans that supported their feminist agroecological cooperative in the name of poverty alleviation have now become a debt burden, pushed them towards focusing on a single cash crop. Is there hope that this quiet social movement even continue, much less transform China's food and agriculture system? My research and my personal life gives me plenty of reasons being hopeless. My mother is gone, my father can no longer farm. The village where I grew up is emptying out. But the women who I work with in Guangxi and the people who I work with in Henan, together with scholars and activists on the ground across China, have not given up. They are farming, organizing, teaching, quietly, persistently against enormous odds, and neither have I. My mother's spirit continues in me and my daughter, who I'm teaching to be like me, both a peasant and a scholar. Having hope for the future of food and agriculture in China and elsewhere depends on whether we, as scholars, can learn from and work with us, the peasants. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. That concludes our panel, and I encourage you to come up and talk to some of the presenters. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.